It is officially 2025 and the Idaho legislature is in session. Now, we've got you covered with a weekly digest on the latest developments coming out of the State House, delivered right to your inbox every Monday morning. It is the Legislative Roundup newsletter written by our very own James Dawson. You can sign up at our website, boisestatepublicradio.org.
More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudet. Affordable housing and giving teachers a raise are two of the top issues when it comes to spending money at the Idaho legislature this year. Now, that's according to the 10th annual Idaho Public Policy Survey, which comes from Boise State University's School of Public Service and the Idaho Policy Institute. School choice, abortion policy, and immigration were also hot topics in this year's survey. So joining us today to talk more about all of this are Dr. Matthew May, Survey Research Director at the School of Public Service at Boise State University, and Dr. Lance McGinnis-Brown, Research Scholar with the Idaho Policy Institute at Boise State and co-author of the survey. I want to welcome both of you to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So is Idaho headed in the right direction this year, at least according to the folks that you surveyed?
The answer to that is yes. So 49% of Idahoans said that they felt the state was headed in the right direction. That's up from where it was last year when the wrong track was our top response. And it's reversing several years of narrowing in a narrower and narrower margin. It's the first time we've seen a gain in the proportion that answered right track since 2019. And it's outside the margin of error for the first time in 3 years. So Idahoans do seem to be more optimistic about the direction of the state.
So what popped up as the top budget priority for the Idaho legislature?
When we asked individuals what they thought that the top budget priority for the Idaho legislature should be in 2025, workforce and affordable housing was the top response for the second consecutive year. It's down 6 points from where it was last year, but it's certainly maintained that top positioning, and it was closely followed by funding K-12 education, and then giving tax relief to Idahoans was the number third response. And you tended to see a little bit of divergence in what was the top priority depending on someone's political party, but for the most part, Idahoans across the state, workforce and affordable housing was the number one issue.
So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of these top issues that you mentioned that are on the top of mind of those surveys. So let's start with K through 12 education. Anything stand out to you in regards to that being one of the top issues?
Yeah, we actually asked specifically folks what their top K-12 budget school or public school budget priority would be. And nearly half of folks said teacher salaries, followed distantly by buildings and facilities and using tax dollars for private or religious education. What we saw is that teacher salary was really the top response across parties, although you do have some less strong agreement among Republicans.
And then what about tax relief?
Tax relief, the past few years of our survey, we've definitely seen kind of an increase in concern and preference for property taxes. That's kind of been backed off on this year's results, where we're seeing income tax and property tax in a statistical tie, kind of putting it back to where it was about 3 years ago when the two were the same. And so it's kind of suggesting that while Idahoans are still concerned about property taxes, it's not quite at the same level that it's been over the last 2 years.
So can we talk about healthcare here in Idaho for a minute? Because almost half of those that you surveyed said access to healthcare here in Idaho is difficult. So can you dive into those numbers for us?
Yeah, as you mentioned, nearly half of folks said it is difficult to some degree, and that may have something to do with discussions around abortion access. One thing that we saw in that question is Democrats were quite a bit more likely to say difficult, as were women. We also asked a question about abortion access, two questions, one related to timeline and one related to exceptions. And what we find is a little over half of folks want to allow abortion access at least through the first trimester, while 64% of folks want to include at least rape, incest, death of the mother, health of the mother, and non-viable pregnancies as exceptions. So those responses may be driving that perception of difficulty.
I also want to talk about immigration because that was on the survey. So, how are people feeling about the economic impact of immigrants here in Idaho?
One of the
So
questions we asked was a split sample question. So we asked, what do you think the economic impact of increasing the number of immigrants or legal immigrants in Idaho is? Half of folks got the version of the question with immigrants, half of folks got the version of the question with legal immigrants specifically. And what we found is that depending on the language you use, responses totally flip. If you're talking about immigration in general, then a larger number of folks say that it hurts Idaho's economy. But if you're talking about legal immigration specifically, then a larger number of folks say that it helps Idaho's economy.
Did it break down by party affiliation at all?
It did, yeah. Republicans across the board were more likely to be skeptical, but Republicans were also the most influenced by the language. So they were about 14 points more likely to say that it helps when you're talking about legal immigration specifically.
So I want to go back to education for a minute and talk specifically about school choice because this was a hot button issue in the legislature last year. It is going to be a hot button issue again this session. You actually asked about school choice on your survey. 53% opposed the use of tax dollars to pay for a private or a religious school. But then you asked if a school choice plan passed, should there be economic limits on who gets it? So, what did you find out in regards to these questions?
So when we followed up that question by asking whether or not they feel the policy should be means tested, 45% said that they would favor such a policy. 41% said that they would oppose. Now, the one thing is we did include in the wording of the question kind of a threshold of households making less than $75,000 per year, which was the median household income for Idaho in the latest census numbers, or very close to it. So we're not able to kind of break away whether opposition is because people are opposed to means testing as a concept, whether they didn't like the threshold we included in the question wording, or if they just don't want to signal support for such a program in any way. But 41% said they would oppose. So it was fairly closely split between support and opposition, but we're not able to really kind of dig into that opposition number given the way the question was worded.
Were you surprised that 53% of those who responded said they oppose the use of tax dollars for school choice? And I asked that question because this is being pushed very heavily in the legislature right now with our supermajority Republicans, the majority of them saying that this is a good thing. They want this to happen. And so it seems, well, maybe they're not listening to constituents.
I think one of the things we were very deliberate in the way we worded our question. We tried to avoid the school choice terminology entirely just because it can mean a different thing to any number of respondents. For one, it may be a specific tax credit proposal. For another, it may mean the ability to homeschool their child themselves. And so we wanted to try to reduce that ambiguity and measure kind of the underlying concept. Should tax dollars go for this effort? What we know from previous surveys we've done where we've followed up and measured the impact on support if something hurt a public school budget, would it change somebody's level of support? And we know that the answer to that is yes. If public school budgets are hurt, it could change the level of support. So the specifics of how a particular policy of this nature is written matter greatly to whether Idahoans are actually going to support it or not. And what we tend to see is, I think, higher resistance to the concept of tax dollars going for these specific purposes. But there can be mitigating factors as you design a policy, whether with oversight, whether adding means testing into it, that can impact people's overall level of support.
And you also asked about a ban on cell phones in K through 12 schools. What did people have to say about that?
What we found there is that there's not a whole lot of disagreement. 68% of folks support that measure, and that's really consistent across parties, across people's perceptions of education quality, and across whether folks have a child or grandchild in Idaho K-12 public schools or not.
So President Trump put a stop on the Lava Ridge wind energy project down in the Magic Valley on his first day in office yesterday. You actually asked about large scale wind projects in your survey. Now, we should say this survey happened way before this executive order happened yesterday. So, definitely coincidental. With that said, what did you find out?
Generally, when it comes to large-scale wind energy projects in Idaho, Idahoans are split. We asked them to whether they had a positive attitude or a negative attitude, and very similar proportions. 36% said they have a positive attitude, 35% say they have a negative attitude, 22% are somewhere in the middle. And what we generally found digging into these numbers is that Republican identified respondents tended to have a much more negative opinion compared to others, and Democratic affiliated respondents tended to have a more positive response compared to others. That said, we also noticed a lot of regional variation with the area around Twin Falls and south central Idaho was by far the one with the most negative opinion out of compared to the other regions.
Was in the Magic Valley.
Yes.
Okay.
They were about
I want
16 points more negative than other areas of the state.
I want to circle back to abortion and dig into this a bit more because you did ask specific questions around abortion. You asked about time limits on when abortion should be permitted, and a majority, 55%, who you surveyed, believe that abortion should be permitted here in Idaho through at least the first trimester. Can you talk to us about what else came out of that specific question?
Yeah, talking about that one specifically, might not be surprising to note that there is a big party split on that. So the top response on that question, at least among Republicans, was completely prohibited. That was about a third of Republicans. But the top response among Democrats and independents was no restrictions. So you see a lot of divide on it. Interestingly, you don't see a lot of difference on this question by education, income, or even gender, apart from women being about 6 points more likely to say there should be no restrictions.
You also found that a majority, 64% of those you surveyed, also believe that exceptions for abortion access should be expanded. Can you talk a bit more about that and the question in particular that you asked?
Yeah. So when we asked folks about what kind of exceptions they might favor, the options were no exceptions, only exceptions for rape, incest, or the life of the mother, or to also include health of the mother and non-viable pregnancies as options, or no restrictions. And again, not surprisingly, you see some party divide on that. But interestingly, even the top response among Republicans was to include health of the mother and non-viable pregnancies as exceptions.
So forgive me if I don't remember this, but is this the first time you've specifically asked about abortion on this survey?
We asked about abortion last year as well, and if I remember right, the results were fairly similar, but I might let Matthew fill in any gaps there.
Yeah, we asked one question last year, and what it got, there were a lot of permutations and combinations of the time periods and the types of exceptions that it started to get a little prohibitive in terms of being able to exhaust all of the options through a survey that is distributed at least partially via phone interview. And so what we did this year was kind of revise the questions, split the timing and the exceptions piece separate from one another so that we could triangulate where Idahoans kind of crossed that majority threshold on both dimensions. And when we finished looking at our results for this year, we can see, as you noted, that majority support on the timing side is through at least the first trimester, and majority support for what types of exceptions to allow includes the health of the mother and non-viable pregnancies.
Well, was there anything that surprised you in those results specifically around the questions you asked regarding abortion?
I think we were a little surprised that there wasn't a substantial gender difference, as Lance mentioned. That there were some minor ones, but they were not necessarily determinative. That said, we did tend to see kind of party splits, and opinions on abortion match very closely with what political parties have said publicly, and people tended to sort themselves into those camps. So on that aspect, it wasn't surprising, but we certainly were expecting to see a much greater gender divide than wound up being
You
there.
also want you also wanted to know how people feel about independent groups spending campaign money here in Idaho. So tell us what you found out.
Sure. So what we did, in part because the general election wasn't over, we went back and looked at the money that was spent in Idaho's primary race in May of 2024. And we asked voters, giving them the context that nearly 3.7 million had been spent by independent groups not affiliated with a campaign or candidate, in those races. Half of the sample, the background context ended there. The other half, we provided some additional context that over 1 million of that 3.7 million came from groups outside of Idaho. And we wanted to gauge their level of concern on the amount spent. And for the most part, Idahoans were concerned. But when we added that additional context that over 1 million is coming from out of state, concern increased by about 8 points. And all of that was concentrated on the kind of the very concerned side of the scale, and the corresponding decrease happened with the not at all concerned. So the people in the middle kind of stayed where they were, but you tended to see a skew towards the very concerned once they had that added context.
So how did people feel about a requirement for those groups to disclose their donors?
Idahoans were very supportive about the potential for requiring out-of-state groups to disclose their donors if they participate in Idaho's election. 75% of Idahoans statewide said that they would favor, 60% strongly favor, and that favorability was above 75% regardless of party identification. So it was across the board.
So for 5 years now, you have asked what kind of tax relief people might like to have, and this year was no exception. And I know we talked a little bit about this in the last segment, but I do want to dig into this a little bit more. So what topped the list, and what were number 2 and number 3 on that list in regards to tax relief?
So the number one response for tax relief was property taxes. So about 36% said that they would favor property tax relief as their number one choice. That was followed very closely by income tax at 35%. So just 1 percentage point separated the two, which fell within our margin of error. So it's technically a statistical tie. This is relatively, there wasn't a lot of movement compared to last year, but what this has done is kind of returned us to the statistical tie that income tax and property tax were in 2022. And so what we tended to see was that Eastern Idaho and Northern Idaho tended to favor property tax relief as their first choice. South Central Idaho around Twin Falls favored income tax relief, while the Boise area and Southwest Idaho were kind of evenly split between property tax and income tax as their first choice. And sales tax was a distant third.
So you also asked about property taxes when it comes to property owned by nonprofit organizations. Can you tell us about this question?
Sure. So some background context we provided to our respondents was that, in Idaho, there are thousands of properties owned by nonprofits, and often these entities do not have to pay property taxes. And then we asked which comes closer to their opinion on tax exemptions for nonprofits like charities, churches, hospitals, and schools. About 51% of Idahoans said that they think that there should be different considerations for each type of nonprofit. So the exemption rules you use for a charity or a church shouldn't necessarily be the same rules or exemption decisions that you use for hospitals and schools or vice versa. That said, about 38% of Idahoans think that all types of nonprofits should be treated equally when it comes to property tax exemptions.
So overall, and I'm going to ask both of you this question, and Lance, let me start with you. What stood out to you in this year's survey?
Yeah, I think one thing that we were surprised about was, as Matthew mentioned, you've seen a major spike in optimism, both about the direction that Idaho is on and the economic future of Idaho over the next 2 years. That was a major spike toward people expecting the economy to get better as well. But interestingly, that those results were probably impacted by the election, but you're not seeing that same wave of optimism fall down to other policy areas like how people rate the quality of education in their state or region, for example, or state or district.
And Matthew, what about you? What stood out to you in this year's survey?
I think, kind of like Lance mentioned, again, there was that sense of optimism. I think anytime you have a question, as we did in what Idahoans expect economic situation in Idaho to be in the next 2 years, anytime you have an answer jump 25 points from the prior year with 44% now answering better, that gets our attention. That said, we were also rather surprised by the healthcare access difficulty response that we talked about earlier in the program, where that was the first year we had asked that specific question, and we didn't quite know what to expect, but it was not that half of Idahoans were feeling difficulty accessing healthcare. And so certainly that's something that we're interested in diving into more with next year's survey.
So this being the 10th survey, but we should note the Boise State has actually been collecting this data for 30 years now. What does this say when you look back on the 10 years of this survey about how Idaho has changed and maybe stayed the same?
I think we're very mindful of kind of the legacy and the legacy that has been passed to us from the Boise State legends like Jim Weatherby, Stephanie Witt, Gary Moncrief, Les Alm, and everybody involved that got these surveys off the ground dating back to 1990 and kind of kept passing the torch along down the road until it ultimately landed with us. But what we are struck by every year is how appreciative people are, whether they're policymakers, the public, or nonprofit groups, to have some sense of where Idahoans fall on the issues, so that is not slanted one way or the other, so that they can kind of use that to triangulate their position and fold it into their decision-making calculus and really do their best to come up with and craft policy solutions that work for the broadest possible population in Idaho.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much. We've been talking to Dr. Matthew May and Dr. Lance McGinnis-Brown about the 10th annual Idaho Public Policy Survey. We will put a link to our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
If you like podcasts like this, explore more from the Boise State Public Radio podcast family. There you'll find a mix of daily news, Idaho Voices, and in-depth series on a wide range of topics. I'm talking wild horses, political scandals, sustainable ranching, and militia groups in a post-January 6th world. Wherever you get your podcasts, just search Boise State Public Radio to find what Idaho's NPR station has in store for you.